Welcome back. I just have one more very quick demonstration to show you, and it's all about one of those neurotransmitters that I mentioned in the last video, dopamine. So dopamine is one of many neurotransmitters that our brain naturally produces in order to give us a pleasure sensation. It does a few more different things other than just making us feel good, but that's really the main thing that you need to understand for the purposes of this demonstration. So dopamine is a happy chemical, and our brain does naturally produce it, but it gets a little bit changed in the amount that is produced depending on rates of substance use and also depending on different stages of substance use that you may be experiencing. So I'm just going to run through really briefly what the normal range of dopamine release is in somebody who is not using substances, and then how that's a little bit different when we throw substances into the mix. So behind me, you'll see the normal range of dopamine that is released. So this is for somebody who is not using substances at all. Keep in mind, these numbers here are actually related to nanograms per deciliter, or it's 1/1 trillionth of a gram of dopamine. So if you're a sciencey person, if you're a math person, and you like to understand what these numbers mean, those are the units of dopamine that are in our system. So this is the normal range of dopamine that is released in our systems. So when we wake up in the morning and we get ourselves out of bed, we get into the shower, we get ourselves a cup of coffee, in order to do that, we need to have some dopamine in our systems. We need to wake up and feel good enough that we can get ourselves out of bed and start our day. Now on this normal day, we release about 50 nanograms per deciliter of dopamine just upon waking up. So that's kind of like where we start. That's our neutral kind of ground, for lack of a better term. Now let's say you wake up and it's the worst day ever. You can't even get yourself out of bed. You just feel completely drained. There's not really much going on for you and you're really, really struggling. You probably still have about 40 nanograms per deciliter of dopamine in your system. So if you think about what it's like for you to wake up on a normal day versus what it's like for you to wake up on your worst day, that's only about a difference of 10 nanograms per deciliter, but it feels really, really significant. So more on that later on. Now let's switch gears and think about your best day ever, where maybe you're on a vacation, you have very, very little stress, you're feeling really well rested, you're really excited about what the day is going to hold for you. It's just your best day ever, okay? Think about that feeling. Now you probably are experiencing about 100 nanograms per deciliter of dopamine in your system. So it's about double what you feel on a normal day when you wake up, but it's really, really, really good and really significant. So this is the normal, healthy range of dopamine that's released in our system, depending on different circumstances. So if it's the worst day ever, we're still gonna have about 40 units. And if it's the best day ever, we're gonna have 100 units. But your brain will not release more than 100 nanograms per deciliter at once. Otherwise, it's unnatural, okay? So from 40 to 100, that's the average normal range that your brain will produce. All right. So we've just gone over the normal range of the release of dopamine that our brain will naturally do entirely on its own. So what happens when we start using substances? Well, I'm sure as we all know, substances make us feel really good. Actually, so good that it's unnatural. When we use different substances, it actually releases excess dopamine into our systems. So if we're using things like opioids or alcohol, we might get, 600, 700, 800, even 900 nanograms per deciliter of dopamine, which is a lot. So you take the substance and then you get this massive efflux of pleasure chemicals in our bodies. And that probably tells us that was really great. That felt really, really good. We should do it again. Now, interestingly, opioids and alcohol and other substances are kind of in this range here. But when we use methamphetamine, it actually increases the amount of dopamine in our system to 1,100 units. So that's like 10 times more than the natural release is supposed to be. That's really, really significant. And that makes sense. We hear from tons and tons of people who have used methamphetamine in their lives, and they typically say that it's the best that they've ever felt. And of course it would be. The science says that it would be. But here's where the problem comes in. So let's say we use methamphetamine once and we get this huge surge, 10 times the amount of dopamine that we would naturally feel in our systems without this substance. But the next time that we decide to take methamphetamine, maybe we feel 900 units instead of 1,100. So we still feel really, really good, but not quite as good as we thought before. If you remember the difference between 40 and 50 and how significant that is for you, or if you think about a normal day versus your best day at being a difference of about 50 units, having 200 units less after using, you're going to feel it and it's going to be significant. So over time, as we use these substances, we actually release less dopamine every single time that we do it. So the amount of dopamine that's released with each time that we use is decreased every single time. But a lot of people, they still try to chase that initial high, that initial feeling when they felt so good and got so much pleasure from using that substance. So what also starts to happen here to make the problem even more complicated is as your brain becomes accustomed to you releasing so much dopamine unnaturally, your brain kind of decides, well, I got a lot of other things that I need to do here. So I'm not going to create dopamine naturally for you anymore. And that makes sense too, because this is actually really dangerous for our brains. Our brains aren't supposed to have that much dopamine at once. So your brain isn't going to keep naturally producing dopamine because all it's doing is hurting itself when you have so much dopamine in your system. So the brain stops making dopamine, okay? So that means that when you're not using, even if you're doing things that used to give you pleasure, you probably won't feel very happy about it. Let's say you're at your child's birthday party, and normally you would be laughing, you'd be having fun, you would be really excited to be celebrating your child, but instead you're just miserable. You're grumpy. You can't shake the feelings you have. You're exhausted. There's all of this stuff that comes along with it. So, the big things to take away here is that substance use creates an unnatural efflux of dopamine in the system. Over time, the amount of dopamine that is released is going to decrease with every single use. And as this is all happening, you're experiencing less pleasure from the things that used to bring you pleasure. So what we have here are some severely unnatural effluxes of dopamine, and your dopamine receptors in your brain are probably going to need some repair at this point because it's really not sustainable at this stage, and that might be when you enter recovery. So now we're left with this. So we need some repair for all of these receptors. We're going to come up to the top number here. Now, in a typical recovery state, people have been known to register at levels between 0 and 20 nanograms per deciliter of dopamine in your system. This is a very, very difficult state to exist in, not only because You may be used to receiving hundreds and hundreds of nanograms per deciliter of dopamine, and now you might have absolutely none in your system. Now think back to your worst day ever when you weren't using substances and you still had 40 nanograms per deciliter. Now think about having even less, okay? It's a really, really difficult spot to be in because you are exhausted, because you are not gaining any pleasure from the things around you. You feel like you're broken. You feel like there's a lot that's wrong with you. You don't feel good about who you are. There's a lot of other factors that come along with having a substance use disorder. So there could be family difficulties, relationship difficulties, legal troubles. There could be housing issues, mental health, trauma, all of these other things that come into play that are really, really difficult. And you also have to keep in mind that if this is what somebody is dealing with in their immediate withdrawal state, and we expect them to fully participate in a recovery program, it's going to be really, really, really difficult. This is not to say it's going to be impossible, but it's just going to be really, really difficult. But remember, at this point, your brain needs some repair. And it is possible. It is. The brain can change, and it does change, and it does heal no matter what kinds of things have been going on here. But we need to give it the time and the space in order to do so. So what can you do if you're finding that you're experiencing this type of a recovery state where you don't have a lot of dopamine in your system and you're finding it so difficult to even just get yourself out of bed in the morning, let alone participate in something that's going to be helpful for you? Well, first of all, arm yourself with this education. Recognize that there isn't something wrong with you. You just have to give yourself some time to heal. It's like if you broke your leg and then you expected the next day to be able to run a marathon. You can't. You need some time to heal. So think of it like that, in those kinds of terms. So arming yourself with the education is number one. This is not a problem with you inherently. You just have to heal from an injury, okay? The second thing is that it's going to be really difficult for you to find pleasure in things because your brain hasn't really been producing dopamine that naturally. Everything is struggling, right? So be kind to yourself. Talk to yourself like you would your best friend who's going through the same thing, okay? Be very compassionate towards yourself. Utilize different positive messaging things as well. So if you're using social media, try to follow accounts that have positive mental health messages and recovery messages, and just surround yourself with the idea of hope. Use positive affirmations. So when you're being constantly reminding yourself of these positive things and you're keeping this stuff in mind, it can be really powerful, and it does wonders for you. Just forcing yourself almost to be in a more positive mindset, even if it's really hard for you to do it, even if you think it's a little hokey, I promise you this can be a really important thing just to get this dopamine moving again in your system. So treat yourself well. Use positive affirmations, try to incorporate mindfulness and meditation, learn how to ground yourself, be still. Make sure that you surround yourself with things that you know do bring you good feelings. So whether that's communicating with your family, whether it's looking at pictures of you and your kids, it could be looking at pictures of places you've traveled or places that you want to travel. It can be setting goals for yourself. It can be watching your favorite TV show that just makes you laugh until you cry. All of these things are really helpful for you. If you are in a state where you're experiencing this, try to flood your environment with positive messaging and things that bring you joy or things that used to bring you joy. And I promise you, if you give yourself a little bit of time to heal, you will get back to this normal release and reuptake of dopamine. Your brain will naturally produce dopamine like it should again, and you will be okay. Thank you so much. I really hope that this demonstration made sense to you, and good luck in your recovery. You deserve it.